Are you ready to make the most of your oil and gas mineral rights? Welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. Get the knowledge and resources you need to manage your minerals and royalties. Here is your host, Matt Sands.
Hello and welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Sands, and I'm here to help you make the most of your mineral rights and royalties. And I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Williams. Justin, how are you doing today?
Doing good, Matt. Enjoyed my Labor Day weekend, and we have an interesting topic to dive into here.
Yeah, I enjoyed the long weekend as well. Fall is in the air, and we're going to talk about some interesting stuff related to estate planning and a specific tool that you can use that allows you to name beneficiaries while you're alive and avoid having to go through probate. And we're not talking about the use of a trust, although the trust is one way that you can avoid probate, of course. But Justin, what we're talking about is the ladybird deed. And it's a really interesting concept as it relates to transferring ownership of mineral rights and other real property to beneficiaries while you're still alive.
Absolutely, Matt. It has an interesting history. So the ladybird deed is a special type of property deed, also called an enhanced life deed, that allows the property owner to retain control of the property during their lifetime while designating that beneficiary who will inherit the property once they pass. And Matt, it's interesting how this came to be because the ladybird deed was believed to be coined in Texas when President Lyndon B. Johnson used it to convey property to his wife, Claudia Lady Bird Johnson. And the attorney who invented the concept used her name in the description of the type of deed. The nickname stuck, and it's really an interesting way to pass this. It's much like a trust, but a bit less flexible than kind of the overarching trust.
Yeah, that's a great point. And with this enhanced life estate deed or ladybird deed, it is something where you can designate the beneficiaries or beneficiary that will obtain the property upon your death. And these beneficiaries are sometimes referred to as a remainder beneficiary or remainderman or remainder men if there are multiple beneficiaries. So if you hear the term remainderman, think life estate deed. And in the case of a ladybird deed, it's a really unique form of that. And, again, like Justin said, it's sometimes called that enhanced life estate deed because it offers a little more flexibility than a traditional life estate deed. So talking about practical application here, Justin, how can you use a ladybird deed?
Oh, okay. You can use it to make sure a smooth transition of your property to those chosen heirs without having to go through probate. So you get that like you do with a trust, and it allows you to remain in control of that property throughout your lifetime, like you mentioned, Matt. Life estate deeds, you lose control of that property unless those heirs are to agree to transfer that back to you. And then with this mechanism, you get to keep that control, and it's that deed you file that skips the probate process and then defines those heirs that you.
Yeah, and it really is useful for if you have real property, thinking about, homes. And in our case, we're really focusing on the application of transferring ownership of mineral rights using a ladybird deed, because it can be a really powerful tool to transfer ownership that you want to keep within the family. You want to retain, control over that while you're alive and receive the benefits of that with minimal red tape, and then have a nice mechanism where potentially you can avoid probate with the expense and time that goes along with that your heirs would have to deal with. So, thinking about application with mineral rights, again, it really can help streamline estate planning. Of course, the caveat here is it shouldn't be construed as legal advice. If you're thinking about using an enhanced life estate deed, be sure to get with your estate attorney, because one of the drawbacks here is that it can only be used in a few states. So you would need to get with your attorney to see if it might be applicable in your case. So, Justin, let's talk about some of the benefits of the ladybird deed.
Absolutely. The ones we've already talked about. So you avoid probate, which saves that time. You maintain the rights to the property, and it has some other things that goes along with it. It doesn't affect Medicaid eligibility, which can be really a significant concern for some individuals. If you were to transfer the interest to someone and else in the 5 years before applying for Medicaid, the government may still count that property as your asset, and this might affect ability to qualify for full benefits. The Ladybird deeds fall outside of the definition of a transfer for the Medicaid qualification process. It could potentially shield that property from being used to repay the cost of Medicaid benefits, also called Medicaid Estate Recovery Plan, or MERP. Other assets might be claimed by the state to help recover those costs should you rack up long-term care or other expenses, for example. If you're able to use that Ladybird deed, the property is no longer considered part of your estate after your death, so it wouldn't be subject to the MERP. Another pro is it avoids those federal gift taxes while you're alive. If you were to gift those mineral rights to your beneficiaries, it'd be considered a gift. If it's above that gift tax limit, you may also have to pay gift taxes. And since that Ladybird deed doesn't transfer ownership of the property until your death, you can avoid having to pay that gift tax during your lifetime. You can maintain homestead protection when it comes to property taxes, since again, the transfer of ownership doesn't occur until after your death. And it allows beneficiaries to claim a step up in cost basis because the ownership of the property is kept within the life estate holder until death. And this can have a big impact, Matt, on capital gain should the beneficiaries ever decide to sell.
Yeah, that's a big benefit, like really any transfer of minerals upon your death, just, going through a will, they would still also be able to claim a step up in cost basis. So the nice thing about this enhanced life estate deed is that you still get to follow that process to hopefully minimize capital gains tax liability should your heirs ever decide to sell. So, and it also allows you to maintain all of those rights that you have to those minerals. And specifically what I'm talking to is the right to sign an oil and gas lease. In other words, the executive rights and the right to receive bonus payments. And then also if you are in the position of receiving royalties, you would receive royalties while you're still alive. And you'd also maintain the right to sell the property during your lifetime if you were to change your mind and decide that you need to sell. Maybe you have some unexpected expenses. Those minerals could pay those expenses. The alternative there is if you don't, sell assets potentially to pay off those expenses, you could be saddling your beneficiaries with debt upon your death. So it's something that's really powerful in that regard because you have that full and total control while you're alive. And their rights to the property to only transfer after you're gone. Now, that's unique to these Ladybird deeds or this enhanced life estate deed. A typical life estate deed, from my understanding, again, this shouldn't be construed as legal advice, get with your attorney, but those are a lot more complex when it comes to changing your mind about maybe who you want to give that property to. Once you use a traditional life estate deed, you may have to go and get permission from the beneficiaries to make any changes or to sell the property. So there's a lot less flexibility with a traditional life estate deed as opposed to a Ladybird deed. And so that's something to think about as well. If you don't have minerals in a state where you can use a Ladybird deed. So something to think about. So yeah, definitely some benefits to it, Justin.
Absolutely, Matt. And they come with drawbacks. So being such a unique instrument, it has some drawbacks to consider as well. And as Matt mentioned, it's more flexible than a regular life estate deed. However, it can be still more difficult to alter than a simple will, let's say. As Matt mentioned, not every state recognizes Ladybird deeds. And as of now, there's only a few states where you can use a Ladybird deed. So getting with an attorney is really essential if this is something that you're considering. There's some other aspects too to mention when it comes to drawbacks. If you're planning on leaving the minerals to multiple beneficiaries, if the situation occurs that they don't really get along, then this could be a problem that you really don't have any recourse to like you could inside of a trust agreement. If there's a disagreement as what to do with the property, it could really be an undesirable outcome and everybody has to work together to sell that property or take actions with that property. Also, if the default beneficiary predeceases the grantor, it might complicate transferring ownership to the descendants of the default beneficiary. One possible option is to name a successor trustee of your living trust as the default beneficiary in the Ladybird deed. But those little details, Matt, they can get kind of complicated when you're using a specific deed like this for a specific property.
Yeah, and each person is unique, and so we can't stress enough how important it is to get legal counsel to help you navigate this. But I think that you hit on a good point about the issue with your beneficiaries or your heirs uh, being in agreement as to what to do with the property. And I think that is something you really need to explore if you're thinking about using this mechanism to grant the property to multiple beneficiaries, because at face value, you may think that everybody gets along, but when lots of money is at stake, that can change very quickly. And in fact, we had in our latest news episode, an issue with a family, suing each other basically over what to do with mineral rights. And so it's something to think about if you're potentially going to be passing this on to multiple people. They may have very different opinions as to what to do with that property. And then they have to ultimately come to an agreement to dispose of it or to do whatever to manage it, kind of a thing. So it's something to definitely think about hard. But, if it's something simple, just as a single beneficiary, maybe it is a way that you can streamline that process. Now, I think you hit on another good point too, with the issue of if your beneficiary dies before you do, you've locked into who that person's going to get. And if you're not careful, don't update that, then that could cause issues with your estate when it goes to try to transfer ownership to descendants of that beneficiary. Of course, that is something that's preventable. Obviously, if they were to pass away before you do, then you need to go in and you can make a change to who the default beneficiary is and correct that so that that doesn't become an issue. So that's just something that you have to be on top of that situation and make sure that you are staying up to date in terms of what your estate plan spells out. I think that the other thing that's important that Justin mentioned is that those ladybird deeds are not recognized in a lot of states. And in fact, it's only a small percentage, I think, including Texas, Florida, and a few other states. So hopefully that list will continue to grow because this could be a nice option for people in other states as well. So.
Absolutely, Matt. I think if you're talking about a situation where you are transferring maybe a singular mineral property to a singular heir, then this could be a really effective tool to use where maybe the cost of setting up a full trust just doesn't make sense. But as we've mentioned, if you have multiple beneficiaries, if you're passing this on to 2 to 4 or 6, 8 people, this is really something that could get messy. If you think about having a ladybird deed for 10 mineral properties that you own, and having to go back and keep that up to date, it may be more effective to look at an overarching estate planning and making sure that you're taking the steps as far as deeding goes to deed the properties there. But it's a very interesting mechanism, and it provides a relatively cost efficient way to transfer a small amount of properties.
Yeah, and if you think about other options, that there's not just the ladybird deed as an option to bypass probate and transferring it to your beneficiaries while maintaining control over your lifetime. A revocable living trust could possibly do that as well. There are also other life estate deeds. Again, like we mentioned, they're similar, but then there's some additional drawbacks as to potentially requiring beneficiaries permission to make changes. So something to consider there. And then, of course, there's always a will, right? So as long as you specify your properties and who gets what, the will can also transfer minerals to your beneficiaries upon your death. But the drawback of the will is in needing to go through probate in order to straighten all that stuff out. And that there are time and costs associated with that. And if you want to find out more about the process of going through probate and other ways to obtain marketable title on inherited minerals, we covered that in a lot more detail in episode 85 with attorney Richard Winblad. So definitely listen to that if you're in the estate planning mode and thinking about different options. That one has a lot of useful information as well, and some interesting stories about famous people that owned mineral rights and what they did with them. So definitely check that out if you haven't already. And, again, of course, the other thing too is if you have a spouse that is your primary beneficiary, another way to deal with that is to deed over the minerals into joint tenancy with right of survivorship. So if you're a married person and you have sole separate property in terms of mineral rights that you've inherited on your side of the family, you intend to pass those on to your spouse. Well, if you deed that over, you'd have to go through the process of transferring ownership to both you and your spouse and as joint tenants with right of survivorship. And that would help your spouse maintain ownership of that without having to go through probate, from my understanding. Again, I'm not an attorney, so take that with a grain of salt and make sure you consult with your attorney if you're thinking about different options for transferring your minerals to your spouse. So, Justin, I think, as we wrap this up, lady bird deeds are a useful tool potentially in some cases. We talked about, I think, that whole Medicaid eligibility is, I think, one of the main use cases because it sort of falls outside the definition of a transfer for qualifying for Medicaid. So I think that could be a useful tool. I've talked to a few clients who are struggling with, hey, I have this asset. What's it worth? I need to figure out what to do with it. But then you have that 5-year period that if you do something, then they're going to ding you and maybe you don't get full benefits. And so it's, I think, maybe one of the bigger use cases if you're in a state that allows a ladybird deed. But in any case, make sure that you consult with a qualified attorney who can help you navigate all of the legal ins and outs associated with estate planning, and then make sure that your estate plan achieves what you set out to do. And, especially as it relates to minerals and royalties. And another thing to think about as we talk about transferring these types of assets to our heirs is how do you try to keep these as whole as possible through a ladybird deed? If you're doing that to multiple people, that is further subdividing or splitting up those assets over time so that as that continues generation over generation, they become so small that it becomes more of a pain to have to deal with it because it's not paying royalties that are significant enough to offset the cost of getting legal help or to go through probate to transfer ownership. And so that's definitely something to think about as we're in the position now where we've gone through potentially multiple generations of handing these down and these things keep getting split up more and more. At some point we got to stop the bleeding and try to maintain that piece of the pie as big as possible, because that'll just ensure that those are as valuable as possible for your heirs. Because at the end of the day, if they're split up too much, if your heirs go to try to sell them in the future, the value is going to be reduced because the potential buyer has to go through the same process to deal with a tenth of a net mineral acre as they would 10 net mineral acres in terms of, theoretically doing the due diligence and needing to go through all the steps to get the property transferred over and pay status and all that stuff. And so there's some, I guess, less desirable aspects to if a asset gets split up too much. So definitely something to think about and to talk with your attorney to see what options are there out there that could maintain that in a large a fraction as possible. And maybe that makes sense to use a trust in that case and then just name beneficiaries within the trust. But then the trust is the owner, and those beneficiaries can change over time, but then the trust maintains ownership of that. So something to think about as well. And lots of different options out there when it comes to estate planning. It's always a complicated legal area to navigate. So getting a good attorney is really helpful. So good luck with your estate planning journey. And if you found this episode helpful, make sure that you subscribe and share it with your family if they can benefit as well. And we'll link to all the resources mentioned in this episode in the show notes, which as always can be found at mineralrightspodcast.com. So until next time, thanks, Justin.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks so much for listening to the Mineral Rights Podcast with your host, Matt Sands. Don't forget to subscribe and share at mineralrightspodcast.com. The Mineral Rights Podcast should not be construed as investment, legal, or tax advice. All information is believed to be from reliable sources. However, we make no representation as to its completeness or accuracy.